We're picking up, continuing on in our series in First Peter. First Peter. John finished up chapter 3 last week, so we're going to jump into chapter 4. I've learned a lot about my relationship with Jesus through my kids. I know for those of you who have kids, you're like, yep. Lots of things that we learn through that. There's obvious things about sacrifice, about selfishness, things that I've had to, you gave up early. But it's all the little things that seem to really teach me more as we continue to grow. And it's not just even things that they say. Sometimes it is that, but sometimes it's how I try to teach my kids. It's how I try to get them to grow up, because I don't want them to be children forever. As much as we want them to be children forever. I want them to grow up into Christian, functioning adults. And so we try to train our kids. It's what parents do. It's one of our primary ministries as parents is to our children, it's to our families. And so as our kids have grown, I've often tried to have conversations with them and try to talk them through things that have happened. And kids are going to do something wrong. And I remember just this week, as I'm thinking about the message, and one of my kids did something that wasn't right, and so I bring them over here and I say, and I look at him and I say, why did you do that? And of course the answer you always get is, I don't know. And I don't know, and then I'm like, okay, how much do I press into this? Then there's like, I need like a pause button, because I don't have the answer right then. I need like a couple minutes to think through the answer. Like, what's the next step? But they're like waiting for me, so I kind of feel the pressure, so I get panicky and I just start making stuff up, and that's not good, right? I don't know why I did it, so how much do I want to push into this? Do you really not know? Or do you not want to know? Because I think there's an element of genuineness there, of just like, I don't know why I did what I did, but I did it. But there's also an element of, if I really started thinking about it, I do know why I did it, but it's really hard for me to grapple with my own selfishness. And there's all the fact that they're like 3 years old and they can't process that way. So I'm processing for them in some ways. But this is, you see where I'm going with this. I think this is how I am as a Christian sometimes. It's like, why do I do the things that I do? You see things like, I know that I do things that I'm not supposed to do, but why? But if we stop and really wrestle with it, it's because I want it. Because that's the way that I want these things to be. It's hard. But then you look at chapters like Romans 7 where it says, I do the very things that I hate. And you go, yes, amen. That's speaking my language. I don't want to do it, but I still do it. It's this idea of wrestling through, how on earth do I live this way? The question I kept coming back to as I was reading this chunk of scripture over and over again is why am I a Christian? Kind of an odd question. Why am I a Christian? Well, I'm a Christian because I prayed a prayer and I believe in Jesus. That's great. That's how you became a Christian, but I want to know what motivates it. Why? Why do you want to become a Christian? What desire within you compels you to be a Christian? That's a different question, isn't it? Because now it's more of what are the benefits? That's the first thing we want to do. We want to break it down to the cost analysis, right? That's what we want to do. Well, I get to go to heaven. Great. I get to go to church at Rock Haven Church. There, see plug right there, right? Yeah, good check mark, right? All these things, we start thinking about this stuff. But then the motivation really kicks in when I encounter something in life that's difficult. Because that's when we start to not think rationally, we just do what we are. We do what we do because that's who we are. I've shared that story about when we get bumped, life, like what's inside of us spills out. Because that's just part of it. But what our motivation is in life is really what gets pushed. What gets talked about, the genuineness of our person when life happens, when things get difficult. And that's where Peter is going to talk a little bit about today. He's going to talk a little bit about suffering. Oh, great. Here we go. And it's one of those, I kind of dreaded thinking about, how do I always seem to want to talk about suffering? And why is it so hard to preach on suffering? And I think it's hard to preach on it because we don't think about it until we're in the middle of it. And we don't want to think about it until we're in the middle of it because we just are praying that we don't ever have to go through it. But if we don't address the issue, we don't address the motivation, if we don't address the heart issue, what's really going on right now, and we wait until it gets difficult, it's going to be extremely difficult. But that's not saying that that situation is not going to teach us. It's not going to teach us. In my Bible, I think it's really a well-titled, at the beginning of chapter 4, a lot of your Bibles, if you look down, they have a little title there. Mine says, Stewards of God's Grace. Now, those titles are not original to the Bible, so they're not they're not the original. They're just something that the publisher has included to help you kind of get a theme for what you're about to read. But I think this one is really appropriate. The steward of God's grace. Because that's really what we are about. Because it's kind of asking the really hard question. How do you experience the grace of God? How do you experience that? How do you get more grace? Well, I know I have grace. I know I've been forgiven. I know I've received grace. But how do you get more grace? How do you have more of that? And even the harder question is, how do you give grace to those around you who need it? Because it's kind of an intangible, isn't it? It's kind of something we can't grasp on. We can't be like, well, you need water? I can give you water. Oh, you need grace? How do you do that? How do you have more of that? How do you extend that to people other than it's just the way we think and it's the things that we are? So how do you begin to change this? So now we're asking a deeper question. How do you change who we are? How do you change how we think? How do you change the way that we love? That's an interesting question. I think of it, when I had kids, when you have kids in the hospital, you know you're about to have a kid. This is after, we've had one, this is after the other ones. We have 4 kids, so we've had a second, third, and fourth kid, and the first one you just love to pieces. Just absolutely love, and you would do anything for. And you go to the hospital, and there's this lingering thought in the back of your head. You're thinking, how on earth can I love another person as much as I love my firstborn? And out comes number 2, and immediately I have no questions about that anymore, but I just love them just as much. And I'm like, how do I love them just as much? How do I have the capacity to love someone more? How do I have the capacity to just love more? How does that work? And it happens again and again and again and again. I just do. I just have more. And everyone who's a parent's like, yeah, it just makes sense, but it doesn't make sense, right? It's the same thing with grace. How do you have it? You just do. You walk into situations in life and it just is there. It's just there. So this is where Peter kind of wants to go. Because we're gonna start in 4, we're gonna see how far we get. But really, it's kind of some interesting chunks in here. So let's read with me the first verse. It says, Since, therefore, Christ suffered in the flesh, arm yourselves with the same way of thinking. For whoever has suffered in the flesh has ceased from sin. Now there's a lot to unpack here right away. First thing we want to address, okay? When it talks at the very end of 1 where it says they have ceased to sin, there is a teaching in the world today that says if you continue to sin that you are not a Christian. That is a false teaching. We do not ascribe to that. Now, do we want to sin? No, we don't want to sin. I'm not telling you it's a free-for-all. But they're saying if you once you accept Jesus and you sin again, well, you've lost it all. You can't get it back in. That's not okay. That's not right. So we don't want to read that passage this way because of lots of other verses in the Bible that tell us that we continue to wrestle with sin until we are fully redeemed in heaven with Jesus. Then we will be without sin. But to be ceased with sin. What does he mean when he's talking about that? Well, we have to kind of go back to the first part where it says this really interesting phrase. He says, arm yourselves with the same way of thinking. What are we talking about? What is he arming ourselves with? Sounds kind of like a military term. It's kind of meant to be that way in the Greek. It's kind of meant to be this military, like arming yourself, being ready. Going back to the last chapter in chapter 3, verse 15, where it says, you are always ready to give a defense because the devil is prowling around like a lion, always ready. Armed yourself with this way of thinking. Armed yourself with this thought. So he's already getting at how are you going to transform the way that you think? How are you going to make that your thoughts always go this direction? Arm yourselves. Be ready. Be consistent. Be thinking about how you want to do this. And the way that he specifically says that is to think about how Christ suffered in the flesh. That's what we're supposed to arm ourselves with. That Christ suffered. Now, can't forget that. Many of us are familiar with the story. Jesus was whipped, he was beaten, he was crucified, died a horrific death, suffered. He felt that. He suffered that. And in his life, he suffered through temptation. In his life, he suffered as a human being would, because he was fully man and fully God. He suffered through that. So how does this give us something we could arm ourselves with? What does that even mean? How does that? I'm like, oh great, I can remember that, and I could think, yes, Jesus suffered so I can suffer. And that's part of it. That is absolutely part of it, to know that because Christ, who is perfect, who is holy, who is God incarnate in flesh, if he can do it, and he did it for us so that we might know him, I can certainly do it knowing that my suffering does not compare to his suffering. Because his suffering was the wrath of all of our sin. An entirely different suffering. So yes, can I go through it? Yeah, I kind of can. But that's kind of hard to still wrestle with. How do you still go through that? Because I'm still in the midst of suffering. If you remember last week, John said that suffering is a gift. And I asked him about it later, and I said, and I used the wrong word. I said, pain is a gift. He goes, no. He goes, pain stinks. Suffering is the gift. And I thought that was a good distinction. Because in the moment, in the season, in life, when we're pushed, when we're pressed, where do we end up? Where do we run to? Where do we go to? Because oftentimes my brain isn't functioning the way it's supposed to be functioning. I'm not thinking as clearly as I need to be thinking. So I resort to what I naturally do. I go back to my motivations. I go back to what I desire. I go back to where my heart wants to go. This is why we have to go back to, it's not just the transforming of the mind, it's the transforming of the heart. This is my default. I go back to that. But in that default moment, God's grace is still there. In fact, for those of us who have gone through suffering, which is most of us, we often feel more of the grace in that moment, don't we? It's a little bit sweeter in that moment, even though it's painful. Because we're a little bit closer. We can't even find a way to be closer to Jesus, but I am. I just am. It's just there. I have more of the grace that I need. I have more of the peace that I need. Even in the midst of something that doesn't make logical sense to my earthly brain, I can't even think straight, but I know right now in this moment there is the grace of God that is so extremely close that it's sweet. It's sweet, and that's what he means by this. They have ceased to sin. Because in that moment, if you guys think back to your moment when you suffered, I think back to one when I was the most suffering for me, and I'm like, I didn't wrestle with sin during that time. There was no temptation. It was gone. Because one, my mind is so focused on what the thing is at hand, but two, I'm as close to God as I've ever been in my entire life in that moment. Sin is non-existent, but grace is even more existent. Peter is talking about these things that are hard to wrestle with, but are there, that happen in life, that are just part of our existence as humans. It doesn't mean we're going to be free from sin until we are there, but we have the free from the control of sin, yeah. It doesn't mean that we're not going to have any suffering or pain in this life, because we will, because that's what it means to be human. But Peter says, but there is, arm yourselves with this thinking. To know that when we encounter suffering, when we encounter trials, when we encounter things that are uncomfortable, there will be more grace. There will be more strength of that relationship. There will be more of a closeness with Jesus. That's just the way it is. So going on to 2, it says, so as to live for the rest of the time in the flesh, no longer for human passions, but for the will of God. Okay, now here we are getting to the most asked question I get as a pastor. The most asked question is, how do I know I'm doing the will of God? It is a legitimate question that people ask because they want to know, am I doing the right thing? Am I going the right direction? I don't want to make a wrong choice. I don't want to do the wrong choice. And so it's a hard question. So John and I open up. We go to John chapter 6, verses 39 through 41, where it says the will of God is to do the will of him who sent me. And Jesus says, this is the will of God, to do the will of him who sent me. Well, Joel, that seems like a cop-out answer, but then it goes on and it clarifies it, to spread the gospel, to expand the kingdom. This is the will of God. Well, it can't be that easy. It can't be that simple, because I don't know if I'm supposed to buy a house here, if I'm supposed to buy a house there. I don't know if I'm supposed to marry this person or marry that person. I don't know if I'm supposed to do this choice or that choice. I don't know if I'm supposed to go to Hardee's or Dairy Queen, right? All the stuff in there, because we get decision panic, or the new one is decision exhaustion, where they get so tired of making decisions that I don't want to make a decision. Just someone tell me what to do. Or they get panicked in the decision because if I make the wrong one, my whole life is ruined. That's not what the Bible's about when it comes to decisions. Peter goes back. It says, so to live your passions for the will of God. And there's the key word, that your passions would be for the will of God. What are the passions of people? But the things that drive us. The things that motivate us. The things that make us go. That's why I ask, why do you want to be a Christian? Because if it's because I'm supposed to be, you're going to wrestle with the passions. Because if it's, I'm supposed to because this is what I ought to do because I'm supposed to go to church, then you're going to wrestle with the passions. But if it's because I want to know Jesus better, then your passions are already beginning to change. Our passions are for something beyond ourselves. They're for something beyond just who I am. I desire the things of Jesus. I desire to go to heaven not because I want to go to heaven. I desire to go to heaven because Jesus is there. The shift has already begun. That's how it continues. That's why it says the passions are following for the will of God. Because he's saying this is what drives you. This is why we need to address the heart of the issue, which is the heart. The will of God is that we would follow. That we would aim for the direction of north and that we would always be running north. Not wandering through the woods looking for that one right path, but aiming the compass north and saying, I'm going to Christ. That's the way I'm going. This is the way I'm going to go. Because this is how I want to pursue him. This is where my passions is leading me. Now don't take this as the sermon message, oh, Joel said just follow your heart. No. Your heart is deceitful. unless it's changed by Christ. That's why we want to follow Christ who transforms our heart. Who transforms our heart. So when we do encounter times of suffering, when we do encounter times of difficulty, and even so if we encounter times of great prosperity, that we're not tempted to veer to the left or the right. We're tempted to continue to follow, because that's the will of God. Verse 3 says, for the time is past. For the time that is past suffices for doing what the Gentiles want to do. The time's gone for doing what the Gentiles do. For the time is gone for you living the way that we used to live. Living in sensuality and passions. Well, Joel, didn't you just say passions? Yes, but this is the passions that I want, not the passions that God wants. Living in sensuality, passions, drunkenness, orgies, drinking parties, a lawless idolatry. Now, the temptation of a Christian, when we read lists in the Bible, is to be like, it's not me, it's not me, it's not me, that's not me. Okay, I'm okay. Thank goodness I don't bow down to idols. Thank goodness that's not me, right? And we just, then we have a sigh of relief. That's like, that's not addressed to me. But that's not what the lists are about. Look at what the passage is saying. The time that you lived like a Gentile, the time that you lived away from Christ, where you were pursuing things not Jesus. That's the category. Are you pursuing things of Jesus, or are you pursuing things not of Jesus? There isn't another category. There isn't a middle ground where it's like, no, he listed the things and I didn't fall into that list, so I'm okay. No, that's not what the category the Bible lays out. There are people who follow Christ and there are people who do not. Where are we? That's the hard question, because what is God asking you to do right now? That's something, John and I were having this conversation. We're talking, because going back to this parenting situation, thinking about how do you want to train your kids? How do you want to train your kids? Because I'm not trying to, as a 3-year-old, try to make my 3-year-old into a 33-year-old tomorrow. That just is not going to work. It just doesn't work. You can't make everyone overnight. I'm not trying to instill all of adulthood now into a child. Become an adult. Why isn't it working? And we get so frustrated with things like that. It just doesn't work. The question is, what is God asking you to do? What am I asking you to do right now and I want you to not hit people with a shoe. Like, that's the thing I want you right now. And it seems funny and it's laughing. But you transition this into what Peter and what is God asking you to do right now? What's the one thing he wants you to not do? Because I think most of us, like me, we have something. What's the one thing he's asking you to do or to not do? This is step by step. He's not asking us, be a mature Christian now. It doesn't work. We grow. Growth takes time. But Peter wants us to be equipped for the journey. As we walk, as we go, what's the one thing? For don't do the things that you were doing in the past. Great. That doesn't mean you're holy. That just means you're not doing the things of your past. Great. Now pursue the things of Christ. We're not going to be there tomorrow, but we need to be further today than we were yesterday. You see the tension there? It's not okay just to say, I'm not doing those things, but we're never going to reach perfection. But I can't just be satisfied with living in the middle. I must pursue. I must take a step. I don't have to finish 10 miles tomorrow, but I need to get at least a step ahead. With respect, this is verse 4. With respect to this, they are surprised when you do not join them in the same flood of debauchery and they malign you. Okay, first off, isn't debauchery an amazing word to say? Debauchery. That just seems to cover everything. What are you? We don't use that word. We should use that word more often. What happened at that party? Oh, it was a debauchery. It's just fun. But it's a word. It's got a lot there, isn't it? Because they're basically what Peter is saying. The Gentiles, they're frustrated with you. They're saying, why don't you join into what we're doing? Because why don't you go out and party what we do? Why don't you do the things that we're doing? They are confused that you do not join them in the things that they're about. And we have to change our thinking on this just a little bit. Because in today's world, we'd say we know the people who are doing the things they're not supposed to do. And if you don't join them, they kind of understand because they know that they're doing the things that they're not supposed to do. But this is different in the time of when this is written, okay? This is written, there is no separation of church and state, okay? If you don't join the parties, you are not doing your political duty. If you don't join the parties to honor the emperor as God, you're not doing your citizenship. It would be the same to, one of the commentaries I read said, it's the same thing as if we were all standing up to say the Pledge of Allegiance and a bunch of you guys didn't do it. And we'd all stare at you and say, what's wrong with you? That's the same equivalent. So there's confused. Why are you not doing this? Why are you not participating? Why are you not a Roman citizen? Why are you not participating in these things? This is what you do. And there is absolutely no comprehension. In fact, there's not just this confusion. There is a revulsion. There is a complete, you aren't doing what you're supposed to be doing. What's wrong with your head? The Gentiles aren't just confused. They're hostile. They don't understand what's going on with us, what's going on in our heads. And sometimes, as a Christian, we do get that. I think there's a lot less actual Christian persecution in America, but it doesn't mean it's not elsewhere. That as Christians, we must live in a way that is different. That we're not considered, oh, you're just a part of the world and you're a Christian. Christianity cannot be just the extracurricular activity of your life. That's not okay, because that's not what Jesus is satisfied with. He is Lord, and He is Lord of your life, and you either submit to all of your life to Him, or you have a problem. They're confused. Why aren't you participating? Why are you trying to harm society? This is why so many, remember when we went to the book of Thessalonians, the church was almost exiled out of the town because this is what was happening. They weren't participating in the state-run government parties that was supposed to be part of it. They were saying, no, we're not going to be a part of that. And they got almost kicked out of town because this is so a part of their culture. This is Peter saying what motivates you needs to go just deeper than what is convenient. Than what means something that we're just avoiding the things that are wrong. Again, that can't be just our definition of Christianity, is to avoid what's wrong, and that's it. But we must pursue Christ. We must let our heart be changed. We must go for what motivates us. That's the question we need to ask. What really makes us do what we want to do? Because I don't think we necessarily always worship what we think we worship. Because we worship what we love. And that's really kind of a tricky thing to stop and think about. What do you really love? I'm supposed to love Jesus, but do we? How do you train someone? And then I'm going back to my kids again. How do I train them to love Jesus? Not just to obey right things. How do I don't want them to not do the wrong things. How do I get them to want to do the right things? How do I instill in them not just a passion for avoiding things that are wrong, but for a passion to want to do the things that are holy? There's a whole different scheme here. One, I'm raising a person who is a ruthless, law-abiding person, and the other person, I am raising a person who loves to follow because they love Jesus. And I know which one we want to be. The question is, how do I get there? How do I do that? Because it translates, how do I train myself? How do I transform my mind? How do I transform my heart? How do I convince myself that this is what I want? And that's the hardest question of all, isn't it? How do I change what I want? Because it's really hard to change the things that I want. And I think it's honestly quite simple as I need to pray that, God, I want what I'm not supposed to want, but I want to want you. Give me a passion for you and not for the things of my life. And that can be an honest, simple prayer. I think prayer needs to be a lot more honest than we make it out to be because we're so nervous of saying the wrong things. When the reality is God is just looking for us to be straight and say, God, I know that this isn't right and I need you to change it, but I don't know how to change it. Will you start? And that's a great prayer. That's a great prayer. I was looking on social media last week and I came across this really interesting quote. And it says, it's not submission until it is difficult. And that was an interesting quote. It's by Joby Martin. If you don't know who Joby Martin is, ask Owen, and Owen will tell you all about Joby Martin. It's not submission until it is difficult. Because if it's something we want to do, it can be submission. Now, obviously, this quote only goes so far. Because eventually, my heart wants to submit to Christ. But it's really true submission when it's saying, God, I know you are in control. I know you have all the power. I know that you're good. I know that you are in the power of everything else, Lord. I know what's going on. I'm in a difficult spot. I'm trying to change my motivation. I'm trying to change my heart. But I know you're asking to do this thing, and I'm having a hard time doing it. That is when this quote comes into play, because that's the submission. Because honestly, if you really truly ask me, and I'm in a room by myself, but people aren't going to hear me, I'm going to say, I don't want to do that. And then Jesus is going to say, and that's what I've been waiting for you to finally admit it. That's where submission comes into play, when it becomes difficult. The rest of it is a joy to serve, to submit. And that's where the quote kind of breaks down. But I thought it was kind of an interesting thought. Picking up in verse 5. It's commenting on verse 4. But they, meaning the Gentiles, those who are living opposed to God, will give an account. Will give an account to him who is ready to judge the living and the dead. Which I think sounds like a really cool Western movie, The Judge of the Living and the Dead. And I can't remember who I was talking to last week, but they were talking about something in their life was going on, and they felt that they were getting kind of the raw end of the deal, and people were getting away with something. And they said, you know what? It's okay, because I know they have to stand before God. And I thought, that's a really mature way to handle it. It's a really right way to do it, because they may revile you, they may push against you, they may treat you misfairly, they may treat you wrong, but everybody stands before God, the judge, living and dead. That's important, as we'll pick up in the next verse. Everyone stands before God at some point. And for those who are Christians, we get to stand before God and we say, but I have Jesus. And that's enough. But for everyone else, can you imagine to stand before God and have nothing to show? That'd be terrifying. But it gives a little bit of motivation to us that it's not about revenge, it's not about retribution in this life, but trusting that God is who God is, and He is a true and impartial judge. Thank goodness we have grace. Jumping on to verse 6, and this is as far as we're going to get. So for this is why the gospel was preached to those who are dead. Hold up. Big passage here, because it sounds like preaching gospel to dead people. It sounds like that once we die, we'll have this chance again, and this is a really common belief, that when you die, that you will be resurrected and Jesus will give you a second chance. That is not true. There aren't second chances in death. When you're dead, that is where you're going. There is no chance like this. So this verse sounds like that, where it sounds like they preach the gospel to those who are dead. Well, maybe there's a second chance. No, the Bible is very clear. The way I like this, the CSB is a version that says this. They say they preach the gospel to those who are now dead. So what's going on in this section of Peter is that there are people who are Christians and have died. There are people who have been a believer and they have died. And there are people who are trying to preach the gospel to, and they're just like, no, I'm not in this. I don't want anything to do with that religion because some of your people in your church are dead. And if they die, then your whole eternal life thing is debunked. It doesn't work. And so I want nothing to do with that because they're dead. And this is what Peter's addressing, saying, no, it's not how it works. You're misunderstanding. It doesn't mean that you will live forever in this life, but you will live forever in the life to come. And so they're saying, no, if you die, I want nothing to do with that. They're hanging on to this wrongful belief that, they died, so therefore nothing you believe is true. No, we don't believe that this life is eternal. No, thank goodness this life isn't eternal. I can't wait for the next life when it's a whole lot better and my body's resurrected and I get to be with Jesus. That's the life that is eternal, that we will never die. That's the life we look forward to. If their motivation is, hey, just what's in it for me in this lifetime? Because not die? That kind of sounds okay. Well, wait, but that guy died? No. What's the motivation? Why are we here? Why do you live? Why are we about this? Because I get to go to heaven? Fine. But there is a whole lot more to Christianity than just going to heaven. It's a complete transformation of life. There's the grace of God in the everyday. There's the walking with Jesus day by day. There's watching myself grow, looking back and seeing who I am not anymore, but who I am now, and looking forward to how God is going to continue to change me. The joy of encountering everything in this life, knowing that there is a purpose in it, including suffering, even though it sucks at times. God still redeems that and gives us purpose in that, even in the midst when I don't understand it, but there is peace. When I don't understand it, there's joy. These are the things that in this life that are so much more. Though judged in the flesh the way people are, they might live in the Spirit the way that God does. It's an incredible ending. They might live in the Spirit the way that God does. Think of that promise. That we get to live not in a broken body, in a broken world, in a sinful world, but we look for the day when we are resurrected in new bodies. Without sin, without disease, without sickness, without pain, without suffering, in a new earth, new heaven, where everything is better than paradise. And I can say that confidently because now it says when Jesus on the cross said, today you'll be with me in paradise, that sinner goes to be with Jesus in paradise, and the new heaven and new earth has yet to be made, so it'll be better than paradise. That's the eternity we look forward to as Christians. And not just because it's going to be sweet, but because I get to be with Jesus, who is my drive, my motivation, my focus, my aim. It's the person in my life who continues to shape and to mold me into to who I need to be. Not even to who I want to be, but better than who I want to be, better than who I need to be. And that's what's so important. Mariel? And so I was reading, C.S. Lewis, and he has a quote in there. For you will certainly carry out God's purpose, however you act. But it makes a difference to you whether you serve like Judas or John. Kind of interesting thought. Is God in control? Yes. But how do we live out that control? Affects who we are. What drives you? What motivates you? It's a deep question to ask yourself, to step back and to really think about it. But we covered a lot. If you have questions, please let's get in touch and talk. Have a great week, guys. Thank you.